Fareed Zakaria GPS, CNN Sunday morning 10 Eastern and Pacific.
Now for our What in the World segment. As Egypt's election campaign gathers pace, we're seeing the rise of candidates from Islamic parties, one more radical than the next. Across the Arab world, the promise of a new birth of freedom has been followed by a much messier reality. And it's raised the question in many people's minds, why does it seem that democracy has such a hard time taking root in the Arab world? As it happens, a Harvard economics professor, Chaney, recently presented a rigorous paper that helps unravel this knot. Chaney asks why there is a democracy deficit in the Arab world and systematically tests various hypotheses against the data. He notes that such Muslim-majority countries like Turkey, Indonesia, Albania, Bangladesh, and Malaysia all have functioning democratic systems. So the mere presence of Islam or Islamic culture can't be to blame. He looks at oil-rich states and again finds that some with vast energy reserves like Saudi Arabia lack democracy, but so do some without oil, like Syria. He asks whether Arab culture is the culprit, but this doesn't provide much clarity. Chaney points out that many countries in the Arab neighborhood seem to share in the democracy deficit. Chad, Iran, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and yet they are not Arab. Then Chaney constructs a persuasive hypothesis based in ancient history and modern economics. He notes that the democracy deficit today exists in lands that were conquered by Arab armies after the death in 632 AD of the Prophet Muhammad. Lands that the Arabs controlled in the 12th century remain economically stunted today. This correlation is very strong and is not simply a coincidence. Arab imperial control tended to mean weak civil society and a large role for the state, particularly in the economy. Chaney documents the latter, showing that the government's share of GDP is 7% higher on average among countries that were conquered by Arab armies than among those that were not. He also finds that these countries have fewer trade unions and less access to credit, features of a weak civil society. There are less medieval factors. It has long been apparent that the dictatorships of the Middle East form close alliances with religious leaders to crowd out other leaders and groups. Indonesia, for example, is a country with the world's largest Muslim population, and it has religious parties just as Egypt does. But it also has powerful groups that are less religious, more moderate, and entirely secular. All these groups compete for influence on an even footing, something that is not happening in Egypt or indeed in the Arab world. Chaney's analysis reminds us that the real problem in a country like Egypt is that the military continues to keep power concentrated, undivided, and unchecked. It maintains its central role in the economy. The chief challenge in the Arab world remains to create a vibrant civil society, which means political parties, but it also means a strong, self-sustaining private sector. The dysfunctions in the Arab world have ancient roots going back over 1,000 years, but this does not mean that the region is impervious to change. History and the habits it engendered are democracy's biggest foes in the Arab world, but these are habits, and they can change. And these are institutions, and they can change. And as they do, things should improve. Chaney gives us a prescription for the very long term, but it is at least a prescription for good change. And we will be right back.